Hello, we have two focuses this week in week 10 with preparation for assignment 3 ideally underway. At least you might have had a look at the assignment instructions and been thinking about what you might want to choose. And by all means, float a one-page A4 essay plan with me directly, or you can also post things on the question and answer for the A2 under discussion thread. So this week we do have a collaborate session though on Thursday night, and I highly recommend you attend. It's to be able to ask questions and answers for assignment number 3, and I'll give a little bit of guidance. The other thing this week that we're looking at is critiques. Now, we're looking at 4 different types of critiques. What a critique is it helps you use different theories to look critically at your case study or conflict resolution as a whole. So the benefit of these critiques is you're able to use them no matter what essay question you're doing. You're able to use them to critique the themes of conflict resolution as applied to your particular case for assignment number 3, and this will help you improve your marks for argument and analysis, and also for using theoretical knowledge and themes of the course. So I highly recommend you consider one of these critiques and what might suit you. Now, just briefly going through them, the first one is a realist critique. So if you were to take a realist critique, the hat you're going to wear is obviously as a realist. Now, what realists would say is that conflict resolution is inherently flawed, and it usually attacks the methods of conflict resolution. It looks at something like diplomacy, for example, and the inherent flaw in it is it fails to recognize that there is inherently likely to be competition between states, that conflict is actually a way of progressing, if you like, in terms of global politics, and that because states have these conflicts, they're likely to be at war with one another. But it's not only about being at war or having overt violence, it's also about power relations. So a realist critique might also look very suspiciously at an organisation like the United Nations or United Nations intervention. And it would say even the so-called best-intentioned intervention on paper will have power politics behind it. So it could be, for example, led by this idea that the US has oil interests in the Middle East, or we see that intervention in Rwanda came very late. So a realist critique might be, well, why? Because powerful interests were at play, which really stopped a consensus around a humanitarian intervention. So that's the type of arguments you might have around a realist critique. So you're looking at those foundations of realism as a theory, that states act in their own national self-interest, and conflict resolution really requires a certain amount of negotiation and goodwill that a realist would say isn't really present in an anarchical global political system. So then critical theory critiques are a little bit similar as well. So for the critical theory, they look at things like liberal relations are involved in conflict resolution as a form of study. So a lot of the methods we've looked at, a lot of the cases we look at, really involve a system, a liberal democratic system, if you like, being imposed from the outside in. So the liberal critique really looks at, is this appropriate? The critical theory critique looks at, is this actually appropriate? Does it work in all cases? So in a way, it's taking an insider-out approach as opposed to an outsider-in approach. So an insider approach might be, if you're a person living in Rwanda, if you're a person who is living in Northern Ireland, if you're a person who is living in Bosnia, what are the actual causes of conflict? And does this outsider-in approach to conflict resolution really attack that? Now, having worked before in foreign affairs, I can see the strength of that. Certainly, working in the diplomatic service, for example, the way that conflicts are looked at would be very different from a person internal. So diplomats, foreign policy advisors do not get involved, particularly in those ethnic causes or the long-standing causes. You might sort of have a paragraph on what the background was into that conflict, or you might even have a little bit more in-depth information, but your goal is not to get involved in that grassroots resolution right at the center of the sources of conflict, where it all started, where the grievance started. Your role is to simply approach it from this point of view of, well, what kind of international solutions could be imposed, could be negotiated. And even half the time, politicians in the countries where the conflict is happening aren't even as aware or as connected to the sources of conflict as, say, grassroots organisations might be, or people, or the voices of those who are impacted. So there can be a really wide chasm between the people who are imposing conflict resolution methods and the people who are most impacted. And so this kind of critique might be really good when you're looking at conflict transformation, which is often getting right at the grassroots. What are the sources of conflict, and what are some long-term solutions that we might have, not only to stop conflict, but to avoid it ever happening again? And so for this, a critical critique might be really useful, because what it's saying is a lot of these methods are only designed for the short-term cessation of conflict, get in, get out, but what we need to do is look at the whole cause behind it a lot more deeply, in a lot more depth. So post-structuralist critique is quite similar, but two things that are often emphasised in post-structuralist theory is power relations. So who gets to decide how we resolve conflict, who are the voices that are speaking into it, and are they truly representative of all? And the second thing that a post-structuralist will often emphasise is language. So, what is a failed state? What is a weak state? Who gets to decide that? What's a strong state? What's a developing nation, versus a developed nation? So it's often argued that even language itself is constructed by certain powers, and this can seek to influence us one way or the other. So, is that healthy, and does that actually add to resolving conflicts as we would want? We see, particularly in the cases of Rwanda, where the national radio was actually used to stir up ethnic hatred. Language in that context is actually really important. So post-structuralists say that language is important all the time, even in how we resolve conflict. In Australia, we've seen this even with trying to look at some of the longer term reconciliation around how First Nations people have been treated. So there's been a relook at even how we use language in that context and in a way that is culturally sensitive. So that's some of the kind of critiques that post-structurists would get at. You'll see that there's common themes here with the critical as well. Who gets to decide, and is it useful in all situations? And then a non-Western critique, again, very similar, except this is looking very specifically at the fact of, if you're a post-structuralist, you might say who controls, who has the major voice. Well, a non-Western critique would say, actually, Western powers have really dominated this field of conflict resolution. It might even look for other models that are more Indigenous or localised or suited to different cultural contexts. So they all have some similarities, but if one resonates with you and if you feel it works particularly well for your essay question, then use it. Like I said, we look at intervention, so that could be critiqued, in terms of why intervention might have failed. You might look at it from a realist critique and say it's because of, the power relations at play, or you could look at it as a non-Western critique. You could say because it was being controlled in a way that wasn't suitable for the local context, or you could use that non-Western critique, for example, if you do a question on the United Nations and whether or not it's successful or not. So there's lots of different ways you can use it. If you're interested in incorporating a critique and you're not sure how to do it, two really main recommendations I have is obviously talk to me, email me, but also for the benefit of everyone, use this week to get onto the discussion thread and float your ideas. What sort of essay question are you heading towards, and is there a critique you could consider adding in? Not necessarily as the main feature of your essay. The essay question's always what you have to keep central, but in a way to lift the sophistication of your argument in the essay. And like I said, this will get you the much higher marks in terms of theory and analysis. So I hope that's useful, everybody. Please ask any questions and use this week to float assignment 3 ideas and, float some ideas around a critique. And, peers, please help each other. This is where collaborative learning comes into its own. Thank you, and I hope to see you at the Collaborate session.